In the summer of 1833, a newspaper in New York ran a story that stopped people cold on the street. A crew of labourers digging foundations on the outskirts of Albany had reportedly uncovered a skeleton measuring 11 feet 4 inches from the crown of the skull to the heel. The foreman was named, the site was named, 3 witnesses were named. The newspaper printed the story on a Tuesday. By Friday of the same week, a brief correction appeared in the lower third of page 4. The skeleton, readers were told, had been misidentified. The measurements had been taken in error. There was nothing to see. But here is the part that does not fit the official explanation of journalistic error. The original report had been detailed. It had named specific men. It had described specific bones, the length of the femur, the circumference of the jaw, the unusual thickness of the skull plate. Those kinds of details are not produced by... I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. They are produced by someone who was present, looking at something real and writing down what they saw. And then something happened. Something changed the account. Within 72 hours, the paper printed a retraction and the bones vanished from the public record entirely. That story from 1833 is not alone. It has company. Over the course of the 19th century, newspaper archives from across the United States, from England, from Canada, and from several European outlets contain dozens of similar accounts. Giants found in fields and riverbanks, in burial mounds and collapsed caves, in the foundations of old buildings being demolished and the earthworks of new ones being dug. And in case after case, with a consistency that goes far beyond coincidence, those reports were followed within days by retractions, corrections, or simple silence. Tonight we're going to walk through 10 of the most documented instances, one by one, and we are going to ask the question that the official record refuses to answer. What was really being found in the soil of 19th century America and the wider world? And who had the power, the speed, and the motivation to make the accounts disappear? Before we open the first case, understand the world these newspaper editors were working in. The 1800s were a century of digging. Canals were being cut across the landscape. Railways were being pushed through mountains and valleys. Cities were expanding at a pace that required constant excavation of foundations. The agricultural frontier was being broken open for the first time by settlers ploughing ground that had not been turned in centuries, possibly millennia. Every shovel that went into the American earth was going into ground that had never been systematically examined, and what came up from that ground was, in case after case, unexpected. The newspapers of the era were competitive, hungry for copy, and not nearly as centralized as the modern media landscape. A local editor in Ohio or Indiana or Tennessee could print what his correspondent sent him without running it past a national desk. These were local accounts produced by local men, printed in local papers for local readers who knew the territory being described and could in principle go look for themselves, which makes the retractions even more interesting. Because the retractions were not local, they came faster, with more uniform language, and with less specific detail than the original stories. The original stories said, here is the site, here are the men, here are the measurements. The retractions said there was an error. That asymmetry is the first thing you need to hold in your mind as we go through the 10 accounts. The first account comes from the Utica Morning Herald in upstate New York, published in February of 1851. A farmer named Hiram Dodd had been clearing a stand of old trees on land he had recently purchased near the town of Lowville in Lewis County. 2 of his hired men struck something large with their grubbing axes about 3 feet below the surface. What they uncovered was a set of human remains of extraordinary proportions. The report gave the following measurements. The thigh bone alone was 24 inches long. The skull, measured at its widest point, was 14.5 inches across. The reporter noted that the bones had a dense yellowish quality quite unlike the chalky fragility of typical ancient remains, and that several of the teeth still present in the jaw were the size of a man's thumb joint. Dodd himself was quoted describing the impression left in the clay around the skeleton as indicating a figure that must have stood somewhere between 9 and 11 feet in height. The article also noted that a local physician, Dr. Phineas Kelly, had examined the bones and confirmed they were human in origin, not animal, and that their proportions were consistent internally, meaning this was not a case of mismatched bones from different sources, but the skeleton of a single individual. The Herald ran this story on a Wednesday morning. The following Saturday, a brief notice appeared on the same page. The paper's editor stated that upon further examination, Dr. Kelly had revised his assessment, and that the remains were believed to be those of a large bear, possibly a species not commonly seen in the region in living memory. Hiram Dodd was not mentioned. The two hired men were not mentioned. No further examination was announced. No institution came forward to claim the bones for study. But consider the original report again. A physician had already examined the bones and confirmed human origin. The article described teeth. Bears do not have teeth that sit in a human jaw structure. The Saturday correction did not address any of this. It simply reversed the conclusion without engaging the evidence. And Hiram Dodd and his clay deposit and his two hired men disappeared entirely from the newspaper record from that Saturday forward. The second case comes from the Cincinnati Enquirer in the autumn of 1858. A team digging along the bank of the Little Miami River to extend a railway embankment struck a layer of compact gravel about 6 feet down, covering a substantial deposit of old bones. The foreman, a man named Patrick Connolly, sent a report to the Enquirer through a local correspondent. The account described multiple individuals. Connolly's crew had uncovered what appeared to be the remains of at least 4 people, all of remarkable stature. The largest of the skulls was described as easily fitting over a grown man's head like a helmet. The shin bones were measured against the arm of the tallest man on the crew and found to be longer. The correspondent noted that the bones appeared to have been placed deliberately rather than scattered by natural movement, suggesting intentional burial, and that among the bones were fragments of a fired clay vessel of unusual large dimensions, broken but clearly identifiable as a container of some kind. The story ran on a Thursday. The following Monday, the Enquirer printed a short notice stating that the bones had been re-examined by members of the Cincinnati Natural History Society and found to be the remains of large domestic cattle, probably from an early settlement period. Patrick Connolly was not quoted in the retraction. The Natural History Society members were not named. The clay vessel fragments were not mentioned. A group of cattle bones does not produce a skull that fits over a living human head like a helmet. That is a physical impossibility for any breed of domestic cattle known to have existed in 19th century Ohio. The retraction did not address the skull measurement. It did not address the shin bone comparison. It simply introduced the word cattle and moved on. The third account is from the Steubenville Gazette in Ohio, published in the spring of 1870. Workers grading land for a new church building in the town of Brilliant had turned up bones that the local physician in attendance had described as those of a human being of very great size. The physician's name was given as Dr. Samuel Brock. The story was cautious. It noted that the full extent of the remains had not yet been determined, that further excavation would take place, and that the discovery had been reported to the County Historical Society. 5 days later, the Gazette printed a correction. Dr. Samuel Brock wished to clarify that his initial examination had been conducted under poor conditions, and that a more thorough review had led him to revise his assessment. The bones were of normal human size. No explanation was offered for why a physician would misread bone proportions so dramatically under any conditions. The original story had specifically noted that a county historical society had been informed. historical societies kept records. If those records survive, they should contain either a case file for the brilliant excavation of 1870 or a note indicating that no follow-up was required. Researchers looking for that historical society record have found neither. The case simply does not appear in any downstream archive. It is as if the County Historical Society received the notification and decided it had never arrived. The fourth case brings us to the Memphis Daily Appeal, which in January of 1876 ran a story out of Tipton County, Tennessee, describing the discovery of skeletal remains during the construction of a drainage channel. The correspondent had travelled to the site and measured the femur himself. He gave the figure as 22.5 inches. He noted that the sternum was of a breadth he associated with a man of enormous chest width. He also noted, with what reads as genuine puzzlement, that alongside the largest set of remains were what appeared to be smaller bones, possibly children, arranged at the periphery of the central burial in a pattern suggesting deliberate ritual placement. 6 days later, a notice appeared under the heading Correction to Tipton County Report. The correspondent had fallen into error through inexperience with anatomical measurement, and the bones had since been identified by a physician of standing as belonging to a large male of no unusual height, the bones merely compressed and distorted by decades of soil pressure. Soil pressure does not lengthen bones, it does not extend a femur beyond its original dimensions, and a physician had, according to the original correspondent, already been on site and not contradicted his measurements at the time of writing. The smaller peripheral bones were not addressed in the retraction at all. They simply ceased to exist in the public record. The fifth case takes us to the Cork Examiner in Ireland in the summer of 1880. A county road crew widening a lane near Mitchelstown broke into a stone-lined underground chamber sealed with a large flat slab. Inside were the skeletal remains of a man of considerable height, with red-brown hair still partially adhering to the skull, along with several worked bronze objects and what appeared to be a large blade, badly corroded but clearly identifiable as a weapon. The Examiner ran the story across 2 days, noting that local antiquarians had been summoned and that a delegation from the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin would be dispatched. 8 days after the original story, a short notice appeared. The chamber had been re-examined and found to contain the remains of an animal, likely a large horse or ox. The bronze objects had been retained by the Academy for proper study. The blade was not a blade, but a piece of agricultural iron of recent manufacture. The Academy delegation was not named. The local antiquarians were not quoted. The red-brown hair was not mentioned. In the retraction, the chamber contained nothing remarkable, nothing human, nothing of historical interest. And yet the bronze objects were kept. An institution that concluded there was nothing significant to report, nevertheless, retained the physical evidence. Objects retained, conclusion withdrawn, witnesses not consulted. That combination appears in this record more than once. The sixth case is one of the most thoroughly documented in terms of original detail, and also one of the most abruptly silenced. The Wisconsin State Journal in Madison ran a story in the spring of 1886 about excavations being conducted on a low mound near Sauk City, along the Wisconsin River. The excavations were being conducted by a local archaeology enthusiast named Carter Holt, who had been submitting regular reports to the journal throughout his dig season. His mid-season report described the opening of a central burial chamber within one of the larger mounds and the discovery of a skeleton he estimated at between 8.5 and 9 feet in height when assembled. Holt's report was detailed. He described the colour and texture of the bones, the presence of a copper headband around the cranium, and the fact that the hands and feet were noticeably disproportionate in size relative even to the body's large frame. He noted the remains had been positioned facing east with the arms crossed over the chest. He had photographs. He said so explicitly. 3 weeks after that report, the journal printed a notice stating that Holt had advised the paper that his explorations had concluded without yielding significant material of interest. The photographs were not published. Carter Holt did not write another column for the Wisconsin State Journal. The copper headband was never mentioned in any institutional collection log, and the photographs, which Holt specifically said he was having developed. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back, have never been located in any archive. The 7th case comes from the San Francisco Chronicle in September of 1895. A crew working a silver prospect in the hills east of the Nevada mining town of Austin struck a natural cave system about 400 feet below the surface. The cave contained a partially collapsed stone structure, and within the structure were the remains of 3 human individuals of exceptional size. The foreman, Jonas Whitmore, stated that the largest appeared to have stood close to 10 feet tall based on the arrangement and length of the bones. The Chronicle ran the story on its front page. 5 days after the original story, the Chronicle ran a notice on page 3. The cave had been re-entered and found to contain no human remains. The structure previously described appeared to be a natural rock formation. The reporter had been misinformed by workers whose judgment had been affected by difficult conditions underground. Jonas Whitmore was not quoted. No geologist or anatomist was named. The mining company representative who had travelled to the site left no statement in the record. The paper that placed the story on its front page ran the retraction in 3 sentences on page 3 and never returned to the subject. The 8th case is from the Manitoba Daily Free Press, published in the winter of 1889. A survey crew working for the Canadian Pacific Railway east of Winnipeg uncovered a burial site while cutting a right-of-way through treed ground along the Red River. The crew chief, Archibald Summers, described 5 individuals arranged in a rough circle, all of remarkable stature. The largest was estimated at around 9 feet 2 inches. He noted that the ground above the burial site had been marked by large, smooth stones, arranged in a pattern he described as deliberate and possibly astronomical. The story ran on a Tuesday. The following Friday, the Free Press printed a correction stating that Summers had informed the paper his earlier measurements had been made in haste, and that a subsequent examination by a Winnipeg physician had determined the individuals to be of normal stature. The bones had been respectfully reinterred. Note that word. Reinterred, not transported for study, not sent to a university or a museum, put back in the ground immediately by the same railway crew actively clearing the site. There is no Winnipeg physician named. There is no record of the stone arrangement having been documented by anyone. The right-of-way was cut through, the track was laid, and the Red River burial site of 1889 disappeared under the roadbed of the Canadian Pacific Railway. The 9th case is the one that comes closest to having left a traceable physical trail. The account appears in the Worthington Advance, a small Minnesota newspaper, in the spring of 1892. A farmer named Ole Hansen, ploughing newly broken ground near Worthington in Nobles County, struck something with the blade of his plough at about 18 inches depth. Over 2 days of careful hand-digging, he uncovered a skeleton described as that of a man who would have stood between 7.5 and 8 feet tall, with very thick bone structure throughout. More importantly, the story described a specific detail that set it apart. Hansen had found alongside the skeleton a collection of stone tools, and among those tools a single large object the reporter described as a carved stone tablet covered on one surface with marks in a regular pattern. The marks were arranged in rows and appeared deliberate. The tablet was kept by Hansen, and the story noted that the Smithsonian Institution had been written to. 9 days after the original story ran, the Advance published a brief note. The Smithsonian had advised that the find was not of significant scientific interest, as the bones were likely those of a tall but not extraordinary individual, and the stone tablet was a natural formation produced by frost cracking. The story ended there. But the Smithsonian's correspondence records for the 1890s are partially preserved. Researchers have gone looking for a letter from Ole Hansen of Nobles County concerning a skeleton and a stone tablet, and have been unable to locate it in the indexed correspondence files. The tablet has never appeared in any collection. Ole Hansen's land has been absorbed into modern agricultural parcels. No marker, no record, no trace. The 10th case closes our survey and is perhaps the most significant, not because of the size of the find or the drama of the retraction, but because of where it appeared. The New York World, one of the largest circulation newspapers in the United States, ran a story in its Sunday edition in October of 1897 describing a discovery made during excavation of a building site in Lower Manhattan. Workers digging foundations near Broadway had struck an old layer of fill at significant depth, and within that fill had found the lower half of a skeleton. A physician who happened to be passing and was persuaded to examine the bones on site, identified in the story as Dr. Renwick Alderson, stated that if the proportions below the pelvis were consistent throughout the body, the individual would have stood between 9 and 10 feet tall. The story was illustrated. The World ran a drawing of the bones with a man standing next to them for scale, in a Sunday paper with a circulation in the hundreds of thousands. By Wednesday of the same week, the World had published a correction. Dr. Alderson had reviewed his measurements and concluded he had made an error, having been surprised by the find and not having his instruments with him. The bones were of normal large human size. The construction project required the site be cleared, and the bones had been removed and passed to a local cemetery for burial. Dr. Renwick Alderson has been searched for in the New York medical directories of the 1890s. The name does not appear in the indexed rolls of licensed physicians for New York State in that decade, which leaves two possibilities. Either the physician was real and the directory records are incomplete, or the physician in the original story was a constructed source, inserted to give institutional credibility to an account that was going to be retracted, a source created in order to be withdrawn. The drawing has not been located in any archive of 19th century newspaper illustration. Now step back from the 10 individual cases and look at the shape of the record as a whole. What you see when you lay these 10 accounts side by side is a pattern of mechanisms. Each one works slightly differently in its local context, but all of them produce the same outcome. The original story was specific. It named sources, it gave measurements, it described physical evidence. The retraction was vague. It did not engage the specific claims, it did not name the counter sources. It simply inserted a new conclusion and closed the subject. That is not how honest corrections work. An honest correction explains specifically what the re-examiner saw that the original examiner missed. The retractions in these 10 cases work like administrative closures. They work like the suppression of a record that was never supposed to become a record in the first place. And this brings us to the wider context that researchers working in the Tartarian and revisionist historical tradition have been building for decades. The 19th century was not just a century of digging, it was a century of institutional formation. The Smithsonian Institution was chartered in 1846. The Bureau of Ethnology was established in 1879 specifically to catalogue the archaeology of the American continent. The great natural history museums of New York, Chicago, and Washington were all substantially built and stocked in the second half of the 19th century. These institutions were not neutral repositories of whatever the earth turned up. They were, from their founding, ideologically committed to a specific timeline of human habitation in the Americas, a timeline that allowed for human physical variation, but not for human beings of 9 or 10 feet in height. That timeline was not derived purely from evidence. It was partly a prior commitment, an assumption about what the evidence was allowed to say. And when evidence began arriving from newspaper correspondents and railway foremen and mine workers and farmers that seemed to contradict the timeline, the institutions had both the motive and the growing means to manage that evidence. A physician affiliated with a natural history society visiting a site and revising a conclusion. A brief letter from the Smithsonian telling a Minnesota farmer that his tablet was just cracked rock. The power to re-examine was the power to reconclude, and the power to reconclude, applied consistently over decades, produced a historical record that told the story the institutions needed it to tell. The Tartarian framework asks us to consider what kind of world would produce these finds in the quantities the 19th century newspapers document. Not one or two anomalous individuals, not misidentified animal bones scattered at random, but consistent, geographically widespread, structurally similar skeletal remains, often in deliberate burial contexts, often accompanied by artifacts of sophisticated manufacture, copper headbands and carved tablets and large bronze objects, the kind of grave goods that speak to a society with complex ceremony and advanced material culture. If you accept that these finds were real, if you accept the original detailed accounts over the vague administrative retractions, then what you are looking at is the physical residue of a population whose existence the 19th century institutions, with their carefully constructed timeline, could not accommodate, and so did not. The Smithsonian specifically has been the subject of sustained attention from researchers in this tradition, and not without reason. It was the Smithsonian that received reports from county historical societies and returned dismissals. It was the Smithsonian that told Ole Hansen his tablet was frost cracking. It was the Smithsonian that, in the later decades of the 19th century, was documented by its own Bureau of Ethnology personnel as having collected skeletal remains from mound sites across the Midwest, remains that researchers attempting to locate them in the 20th century could not find. The Bureau's own catalogue contains references to specimens not in the Smithsonian's currently accessible collections. Among the missing specimens are repeatedly the ones from sites where unusual size had been reported in the initial field notes. That pattern does not prove a deliberate suppression program. It is consistent with one. What was at stake if these finds were real and were being systematically managed? If the Americas were home to a population of beings of significantly greater physical scale than any currently documented human group, and if that population built the earthworks the mound surveys were cataloguing, and if the artifacts found with their remains showed a material sophistication inconsistent with the timeline the academies were committed to, then the entire framework of American prehistory would have to be reconsidered. The scholars who had written the textbooks would have been wrong about the most basic facts. When the Earth kept producing evidence that the accepted story might be wrong, the response was not open investigation. The response was administrative closure. Retractions in Tuesday papers, unnamed physicians on Wednesday, bones reinterred under railway beds, photographs never developed, tablets classified as frost cracking, cases closed before they could be examined. The 10 cases in this documentary are 10 documented instances of that closure. In each case, the machinery worked. The story was killed. The evidence disappeared. The witnesses fell silent or were never quoted again. And the bones, in almost every case, vanished. Reinterred, retained by unnamed institutions, buried under new construction, dissolved into the long silence of the archive. What they represented, what they might have proved, what they might have forced a confrontation with, remains unanswered. Not because the question is unanswerable, but because it was never allowed to be properly asked. The retractions were not the end of the investigation, they were the prevention of one. There is one final thing worth saying, and it concerns the newspapers themselves. The editors who ran these stories were local men running local papers for readers who lived close to the ground being described. When they printed a story about bones found in a nearby field, their readers could in principle go look. When they printed a retraction, their readers could in principle ask questions of the foreman or the physician named in the original account. And yet, in case after case, the retractions were accepted. Nobody in Worthington, Minnesota appears to have gone back to Ole Hansen and asked him to show them the tablet the Smithsonian called frost cracking. Nobody in Austin, Nevada appears to have returned to Jonas Whitmore and asked him to describe the cave again. The retractions did not just close the stories, they closed the social permission to ask about them. Once an institution had spoken, once the physician had revised, once the Smithsonian had issued its judgment, the question became improper. The story became embarrassing. And embarrassment is the most powerful tool of institutional management. Not force, not secrecy. Embarrassment, the suggestion that to keep asking is to be the kind of person who does not understand how these things work. The 10 cases in this documentary were not just buried by retractions, they were buried by the social cost of continuing to believe them. That cost was imposed systematically by institutions that understood perfectly well what they were doing. Whether what they were doing was the protection of a false timeline, the management of a genuinely dangerous truth, or something else entirely, the evidence in the newspaper archives does not finally resolve. What it does resolve, clearly and with a specificity that should not be easy to dismiss, is that something was being found and something was being done to make sure it stayed found in the ground where no one would have to answer for it.